In this video, we're going to show you how to make the Mandrel for the Spur Gear project. This is our Spur Gear blank. This is our Spur Gear when it's completed. This is our Spur Gear Mandrel. So the way this works, our Spur Gear blanks are going to have a 1-inch hole in it, exactly 1 inch. Then we're going to have a mandrel that tapers about 1.5 thousandths per inch. So it'll look like this. It's 6 inches long. It's 1.5 thousandths large on that end, 1.5 thousandths small on this end, and it's just common steel, not heat treated. It's going to have a center at each end and a chamfer on each end, a 16th chamfer at 45 degrees. So we're going to press our gear blank on this, and it'll stop about halfway. That way we can put this in the indexing head and we can machine our teeth on the gear. So step one, we've got to make this mandrel. So when you get the mandrel made, then we'll come back and we'll look at how to make the spur gear, how to make the arbor that's going to hold the cutter, and we'll get this project completed. All right, for the spur gear project, eventually it will look like this, but we've got to make a blank that will look like this. So what we'll do, you'll be assigned a gear to cut from this sheet right here. It's front and back. It will have the number of teeth and the diametrical pitch on it to match up to your gear cutter. And it will tell you basically the outside diameter, the tooth width, the depth of the cut, and things like that. But first, we've got to make a blank. So the blank is tool steel. It's going to be 01 tool steel. Now, the one thing you want to notice is the diameter is going to vary depending on which gear you have, and the outside diameter is on that handout. But a couple things we want to notice is the width of the gear, 1 inch plus or minus a half thou. That's not too much of a problem for you guys. The hole is probably the most critical part. This hole has to be 1 inch plus or minus a half thou. Because remember, it's got to slide on this mandrel. You're going to make this mandrel, then you're going to take the arbor press or probably the hydraulic press and put about 2 tons of pressure on this, and you're going to force this mandrel till this gear blank is about halfway. So this mandrel is already made, in the center of the mandrel is 1 inch. So you're going to press this blank on there, and this blank has to have a 1 inch hole plus or minus a half thou in the middle. Best to be a little bit under. That way it will force itself onto your mandrel. So the diameter is going to vary depending on which gear that you have selected, the number of teeth. But they're all going to be 1 inch wide with a 1 inch hole, half thou tolerance. And we are going to put a little bit of chamfer on here. It's not on your print, but we're going to put just a little bit of chamfer on these sides. And what I did, I set it at a 45 degree, and I'll leave this here in the classroom. 45 degree at 62.5 thousandths. Okay, so that's how we're going to make the gear. We're going to start with the blank, we'll press it on the mandrel, and then we'll cut this gear. The next part for our spur gear project, here's the spur gear again. The next thing we need to make is an arbor to hold the cutter. So you'll each get a cutter like this, and the cutter will have the diametrical pitch and the cutter number and the number of teeth range on the cutter. But you've got to have a way to hold it. So you're going to make this. The cutter is going to go on it like this. I have a supply of nuts that are 1 inch 12 thread. It'll go in the vertical mill like this, and your cutter, or your gear blank rather, and your cutter will come into contact like this. This is the way that it will work. Typically we cut these gears in the horizontal mill, but we're doing them in the vertical mill now. So to make this arbor, it's called an arbor, and they're very expensive, by the way. We're going to make it out of tool steel, so make sure you get some 01 tool steel. You have the drawing here. You'll have the drawing in your packet, and also I'll have this part sitting on the table so you can look at it to see a little better of what it's supposed to look like. There's some critical dimensions on here. The thread, not so critical, but this dimension from here to here, right here, that's the shoulder where this gear cutter is going to set. It has to be 1 inch plus nothing, minus probably maybe a half thou. It's got to be really, really tight here. Not so much on this 1.5 diameter here, not a big deal. This right here, this shank needs to be 3/4 plus or minus maybe a half thou. So what we typically do is make this big. We're gonna make this part about 10 thousandths big on everything. It's gonna have a center at both ends. We're gonna face center drill it, get it to length. And it doesn't really matter which end we turn since we have centers in it, but you definitely want to use a 4-jaw chuck, and you want to put an indicator on it, get it within 1/10 right now. Okay? Because if you throw it in a 3-jaw, it's going to be, the concentricity is going to be off, it's going to wobble, it's going to be crazy, it'll be junk. Don't do that. Put it in a 4-jaw chuck, locate it on center. And so what we would typically do is, if we work at this end, we'd cut those threads, leave this a little big right here. Okay, remember this is gonna be 1 inch right here. When we're done, it's gonna be 1 inch. So we can leave it a little bit big. We can leave it about 10 big if we want. But then we'll wanna come back and cut where the threads are gonna go. We wanna cut that down to 1 inch or maybe 9/98, and we'll thread that. It's gonna have a couple little grooves. They're 31 thousandths grooves. And there's a reason for that, because the cutter has to have a clearance right here, or else it won't go all the way down and seat. So leave this a little bit big, turn this down to about 9/98, cut the threads on it. You have a place to stop. Leave this big. This, not a big deal. If you want to make it 1.5, leave it 1.5. I like to grind it to make it look good. So if it were me personally, I would make it 1 5/10. On this shaft or the shank here, we want to make it 7/60. It's going to be 7/50 when you're done. Then you're going to put it in the ODID grinder, the cylindrical grinder. Then you're going to come back after it's heat treated. You're going to heat treat it first, once it's all made. But let me share one thing with you. It does have a key, if you can see the key in it. It does have a keyway cut into it. The drawing doesn't show that, but it's going to have a keyway cut in it just like that. It's 1/4 inch keyway, because if you notice that your gear cutter has that 1/4 inch key in it. So we're going to cut a 1/4 inch key in it, cut the threads on it, leave this big, leave this big, leave this big. It'll be to length. Your width here is 1 inch. It's not life and death, but it needs to be close. Then when you're done with all of this, then you'll heat treat it. And the instructions for heat treating 01 are in the top drawer, right below the heat treat oven. Once you heat treat it, it may warp just a little bit. 01 likes to kind of move around on you, so it may warp just slightly, but remember, we're leaving everything big. After you heat treat it, check the hardness. It should be about 58, 55. Draw it back down to get it to about 50, 52, somewhere around there. Once you do that, then you're going to put it on the OD grinder, and you're going to grind this shoulder to exactly 1 inch, this somewhere around 1.5 inches, and then this shank needs to be 7/50, plus or minus a half thou, plus or minus a half thou. Well, actually, probably minus a half thou, no over the 1 inch, but maybe a half thou under on this part right here. Because remember, this gear cutter has to slide on there very, very precise. Because if it's anything's crooked, that cutter will wobble, it'll go off center, it'll throw everything off. So after you get done heat treating, you draw it down, then you're gonna put it on the OD grinder, and you're gonna grind it down to 750, plus or minus maybe, let's see, a half thou on that. This one, grind it down to 1.5, somewhere there. But this one has to be right here, 1 inch, plus nothing, minus maybe a half thou, okay? Because that one really has to be right. So before we can even make the gear, we've got to make a mandrel to hold the gear blank. We have got to make the gear blank, we talked about that, and we've got to make this arbor to hold the gear cutter. So once all of that is made, then we're ready to cut the gear. So in my next video, I'll show you how we set up the indexing head, how we do all the calculations to cut the gear. So join me then, all right?